Casement. He's a friend of Joseph Conrad, and he writes a report in 1903 in England on the atrocities and the terrible situation in the Congo. Now, King Leopold is getting under pressure in Europe, so he decides to set up what he calls an international commission of inquiry. But he's quite comfortable because he sets up this commission, and he strongly influences who is on the commission, and he expects the commission to clear his name. The commission is supposed to leave for Congo, hold hearings, hear witnesses, and produce a report. Now, things don't go so well for Leopold because the commission goes. Here you see them at a local village where they speak to the dignitaries and hold these hearings. And after several months in the Congo and taking 370 depositions, the conclusions confirm, in fact, the reports by Morel, by Casement, and the critical missionaries, and the report is very damning for Leopold II. Now, this is a day and age, 1906, with well-established newspapers. So there are interviews with Leopold II. And in one of these interviews, he reacts to the findings of the commission and the situation in the Congo. And in this quote, I think you hear his voice. It must be noticed, however, also that King Leopold himself never really visited the Congo, but obviously he was responsible for the atrocities and for the violence perpetrated in his name. In the interview, he says, "It's curious what satisfaction certain people get spending their lives libeling others. I suppose there is nobody in Europe painted as a monster of such blackness as I am. The words used in picturing my perfidy cannot be repeated in polite society. I'm an ogre who delights to torture helpless African Negroes. It would be absurd for us to mistreat the blacks, because no state prospers unless the population is happy and increasing." But despite these PR efforts on his part, his time in the Congo was over after the commission produced its report. And this is, again, these are the pictures of the palaces. For example, this is now the Colonial Museum in Tervuren, and the infrastructure that was financed in Belgium through the exploits of King Leopold II. Between 1 and 10 million people were killed. I think already this range is a slap in the face of Africans, that, we don't really know how many people were killed during the colonial reign of King Leopold in the Congo. This is what Africa looked like in 1910, and this is here central, one of the biggest territories in Africa, Belgian Congo. Because King Leopold withdraws, steps down as administrator or as owner of the Congo, and hands over the Congo to the Belgian government. All right, let's maybe take a little break, have a cup of tea, and then we come back. You can pause the video, and then you can come back and we talk about the independence and the Cold War in the Congo, where basically the murder, the violence, and the pillage continues. Maybe when we talk about independence and when we talk about, let's say, the situation in Africa in the late 20th century and still in the early 21st century, it might be wise to look at the work of Thomas Pogge, who writes about poverty and what he calls explanatory nationalism. Thomas Pogge explains to us that when we write about the problems of, for example, Africa, there's often this reference to corruption and to the problematic governance of local regimes. And he says, what we fail to see often, and what we often on purpose forget, is to look at the foreign and global influences regarding these flawed governments and institutions in Africa. You cannot explain the problems of the Congo by only looking at the Congolese actors. You have to broaden your view, and you have to look at the global actors that are involved in the Congo, or in supporting the local powerful elites in the Congo. According to Pogge, there are powerful external actors, for example, these transnational corporations that pursue maximum extraction at minimum cost. You have to take into account what he calls the international resource privilege, that once someone is at the helm of government in these states, that they can capture as much as possible, and they become, they are in charge of extracting the resources, and also the regime has the ability to borrow money internationally and create debts, which then is a huge burden on the local population. But his main message is, Pogge's main message is, don't forget to look at the external actors when we try and explain the problems of Africa. And therefore, very briefly, I want to speak about the independence period in Congo and who was involved in the oppression in that particular period. So indeed, in the 1960s, many African countries became independent. For example, Zambia in 1964, Zimbabwe in 1980, with the famous Bob Marley concert. And you could say that only in 1994, when South Africa adopted its new constitution after Mandela was released, only in 1994, the whole continent was so-called independent. But we also have to realize that the Cold War in the 1960s and 70s was fought in Africa. And one of the countries in which this fight took place was the Congo/Zaire. And what we see, and that is what I briefly want to discuss, what we see is that the first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated, and his successor, Mobutu Sese Seko, became one of the most brutal pro-Western dictators in 1971, who changed the name of the country to Zaire. Here we see pictures around the time of the independence of Congo. We see Patrice Lumumba and the first president, Kasavubu, and we see the Belgian king, King Baudouin, young man at the time. Patrice Lumumba, an African intellectual, well-educated, very proud, and also very critical about Belgian interference in the Congo, and wanting to express the frustrations and the hurt of his people to the rest of the world. So what Lumumba does is, during the independence celebrations, the official handover So here we see King Baudouin and some of the white military, Belgian military and white dignitaries sitting on the podium, and Patrice Lumumba delivering the speech, the independence speech. Lumumba, in the eyes of King Baudouin, offends the West. Now, I'm not going to read this whole quote, but basically what Lumumba does, and you can actually listen to parts of the speech on YouTube. It's a very powerful speech where he basically says, you know, Belgium has done terrible things in the territory, and that, you know, it was not some kind of friendly gesture by Belgium to give us our country back, but it was by fighting that it has been won, a day-to-day fight, an ardent and idealistic fight, a fight in which we were spared neither privation nor suffering, and for which we gave our strength and our blood. And he ends the speech saying, "We have known ironies, insults, blows that we endured morning, noon, and evening because we are Negroes." And this speech has, by the new African leader that recognizes the suffering that took place, the violence that took place, the enormous amount of deaths that were caused by the Belgian interference, this speech really offends the old colonial power. And it has tremendous consequences, and very, very sad consequences, which is described in two books. First, very important book that came out, The Assassination of Lumumba, and recently this book came out, Death in the Congo, Murdering Patrice Lumumba. Because 7 months, just realize this, 7 months after independence and after the independence speech, Prime Minister Lumumba is assassinated, arrested and assassinated in the Congo. And it has now become clear that Belgian and American forces were involved in the assassination. I won't play the clip, but there are these links here that you should absolutely look at yourself. This is a clip of a cinema news item. And what you see here is that Lumumba is captured and is being manhandled by the soldiers of Mobutu. Now, after many years, and particularly after certain CIA files became public files, it now has become clear who was involved in the murder of Lumumba. So first there was a CIA operation called Operation Barracuda. It was an aborted attempt to poison Lumumba, and it was a failed attempt. But in the end, the Belgians became involved. They supported the elimination of the Lumumba government. They recognized the independence of Katanga province under another leader, namely Tshombe. Here you see the divide and rule policy of the former colonial power. But in fact, King Baudouin himself became involved in ordering a solution, and he requests, and there are records of this, he requests elimination définitive of Lumumba. And Lumumba is captured, arrested, and brought to a prison in Katanga. And Katanga is the province where the opponents of Lumumba were in power, and from that moment onwards Lumumba disappears. And there are now sources that have confirmed that he was shot in the jungle, and that his body was chopped up and burnt, so that no one could visit this place of a grave of one of the first great African leaders. But also the United Nations in that period under Dag Hammarskjöld is criticized because they didn't come to the aid of Lumumba, and they turned a blind eye when he was taken prisoner. They had a presence in Congo at the time. In 2001 there is an inquiry by the Belgian Parliament. And this was the first time when they said, Belgian ministers at the time were morally responsible for what happened. And there was a declaration saying that King Baudouin violated the constitution by acting alone. Now, if we fast forward to 2020, we see, and also returning to the beginning of this lecture, we see that the Black Lives Matter movement has become quite active in Belgium as well. Here we see a picture of one of the busts of King Leopold that is being removed. And this pressure and this renewed attention for the atrocities that took place in the Belgian Congo have spurred the parliament in Belgium to set up a Congo committee that is going to start work roughly now, so the summer of 2020, to look into its colonial past, the Belgian colonial past, and to try and promote reconciliation with those living in Belgium and with the people living in the Congo. There are plenty of other examples of Cold War conflicts in Africa. Let's not forget Angola, a 27-year-long war where the UNITA resistance movement was supported by the West, trying to get rid of the Angolan Marxist regime. This only ended in 2002. In Mozambique, one of the most horrible wars taking place on the African continent, 19 years until 1994. This Renamo resistance movement, also supported by the West, fighting a Marxist regime. And then you could say South Africa, where the ANC fought the apartheid regime until 1994. So lots of conflict, Cold War conflicts in Africa taking place, where the big powers were clashing. All right, this is it for now. So what we have looked at is some of the examples of, particularly in the Congo, of the atrocities taking place in Africa, and the enormous focus on the extraction of resources in Africa. And some would say that this type of extraction is still taking place, but in a very different form in the 21st century. Anyway, I hope it was interesting, and that we will meet soon in a more healthy environment. So stay healthy, stay fit, and goodbye from me.